In 2011, a couple returned to their flat in Nizhny Novgorod after a long holiday. Their adult son, Anatoly Moskvin, had stayed behind while they were away. At first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The apartment was messy, but that wasn't unusual. Books were stacked in every corner, papers covered the tables, and Soviet memorabilia lined the shelves. It was how the place always looked with Anatoly around. Cluttered, academic, slightly odd. But then they looked closer. All around the apartment were life-size dolls. At least they looked like dolls. Dressed in frilly dresses and satin bows, some with scarves around their heads, others wearing knee-high boots. They were seated on couches, propped up in chairs, even tucked into spare beds. Their hands were gloved, faces painted with what looked like makeup, their skin pale and waxy. But the smell told a different story. Police were called, and soon, what was inside the apartment would shock the entire world. Anatoly Moskvin wasn't just a quiet historian with a fascination for cemeteries. He was something else entirely. Inside his home, authorities discovered 26 human bodies, the preserved corpses of young girls, aged between 3 and 15. He hadn't just dug them up. He had taken them home, mummified them, and turned them into something else. Something he called his girls. You're watching the Crim Vault, where we document the darkest and most unsettling true crime stories from around the world. Anatoly Yuryevich Moskvin was born on September 1st, 1966. A gifted child, he spoke multiple languages by adolescence, devoured books, and had an almost encyclopedic knowledge of Russian history. Classmates described him as socially awkward, but academically brilliant. He didn't date, didn't party, didn't care for sports. What he cared about was death. By the time he was a teenager, he was already walking through graveyards for fun, not in a rebellious or macabre way, more like a ritual. He claimed he could feel a spiritual connection with the dead. In one of his personal essays, Anatoly wrote about a moment in his youth when a group of men forced him to kiss the face of a dead girl during a funeral ritual. He said the moment changed him forever. Whether it was true or not, no one could verify, but he referred to it as his first connection with sleeping beauties. Over the years, he became obsessed with burial customs, ancient tombs, and rituals around death. He wrote for academic journals, lectured at universities, and contributed articles to local newspapers. He wasn't an outcast in the traditional sense. He was respected, even admired in intellectual circles. But very few people really knew what he did outside of work. That's because Anatoly spent most of his time alone, or rather, with the dead. He lived in a modest flat with his parents, even into his 40s. To them, he was simply eccentric, a little odd. He spent most days at cemeteries, claiming he was researching for his writing. He would sleep on grave sites, clean neglected headstones, and take notes. Sometimes he'd even sing to the graves. But what no one realized was that he had moved far beyond research. Between 2003 and 2010, Anatoly began robbing graves. But not for money, not for jewelry, not even for ritual. He was after something else entirely: companionship. Using a method he claimed to have read about in ancient texts, Anatoly would wait until recent burials, then return at night. He dug through the soil, opened the coffins, and carefully removed the small bodies inside. He was particularly drawn to graves of young girls. Sometimes he'd search for obituaries that moved him. Girls who had died tragically, or suddenly, or alone. He claimed he felt sorry for them, that they didn't belong in the cold earth. He would bring the bodies home in bags or trolleys. Once there, he began the process of preservation. He dried them with salt and baking soda, filled the bodies with rags to hold their shape, and covered their faces with wax or nylon tights. Then he painted eyes over the wax, sometimes gluing toy eyes into the sockets. He dressed them in clothes he'd collected over years, occasionally sewing elaborate garments by hand. He gave them names, birthdays, personalities, and then he spoke to them. He watched cartoons with them, held tea parties, slept in the same room. He said he believed the spirits of the girls were still alive, and that if he could keep their bodies intact, they might one day come back. He wasn't trying to hide them, but he wasn't flaunting them either. He claimed his parents never questioned the figures because they assumed they were large dolls. Old mannequins, maybe, part of his strange collection of artifacts and curiosities. But after his parents returned from their trip and made the discovery, they finally contacted police. When officers arrived, they were horrified by what they saw. In every room, the figures sat in silence. Some wore makeup, others were dressed like children going to school. One even had a music box placed inside his chest cavity. Another had buttons for eyes, just like the movie Coraline. But these weren't props. These were human remains. Anatoly was arrested on the spot. But during questioning, he didn't act like a criminal. He acted like someone defending his children. He refused to call them corpses. Instead, he called them his girls. He insisted he had rescued them, that he had given them life, that they were happy to be with him. Authorities didn't see it that way. He was charged with desecration of graves and abuse of human remains. But when psychiatrists evaluated him, they found him to be suffering from a chronic form of paranoid schizophrenia. He was declared unfit to stand trial and instead committed to a psychiatric facility. The public reaction was explosive. Photos of the dolls circulated online, fueling both horror and fascination. Some tabloids dubbed him the Russian Dollman. Others simply called him a monster. But those who had worked with Anatoly were stunned. How could someone so intelligent, so respected, commit something so twisted? The families of the dead were devastated. Many of them had believed their children were resting peacefully, undisturbed. To find out their daughters had been dug up, redressed, and turned into toys, it was beyond comprehension. Several parents requested that their loved ones be reburied under new names in secret locations to avoid further desecration. But the story didn't end there. In 2014, there were whispers that Anatoly might be released. Hospital staff reportedly said he was responding well to treatment, that he was stable, that he showed no signs of aggression. There was even a rumor that he had petitioned the court to allow him to marry another patient. Public outrage followed. Families protested, demanding that he remain locked away. In 2018, his doctors requested an evaluation to determine whether he could be released into outpatient care. Once again, the court denied it. But as of recent reports, Anatoly Moskvin remains in a psychiatric hospital, not a prison, and still technically not convicted of any crime. Today, he would be in his late 50s, and his story is still discussed on forums, podcasts, and YouTube videos across the world. Because unlike many killers, Anatoly wasn't driven by rage, or lust, or power. His crimes were bizarre, clinical, and disturbingly tender. In his own words, he didn't want to harm the girls. He just didn't want them to be alone. That's what makes it harder to categorize, harder to explain. This wasn't just death fetishism. This was someone who lived in a fantasy world so deeply that reality itself seemed optional. He called himself a necropolitician, a self-appointed guardian of the forgotten dead. He said he hated cemeteries because they left the dead cold, unloved, and discarded. So he brought them home. To most, that sounds like madness, but to him, it was love. Let us know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our weekly episodes on the Crim Vault.